My name is Victoria Barnett. I'm a visiting lecturer in Jewish Studies here at UVA this year, and it is really a very great pleasure and honor to welcome a longtime friend and colleague in the field, Dr. Doris Bergen. Doris Bergen is this year the visiting Shapiro Scholar at the Mandel Center for Advanced Holocaust Studies at the Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C., doing a new research project on ethnic Germans during the Holocaust. But she is also the Chancellor Rose and Ray Wolf Professor of Holocaust Studies in the Department of History and the Tannenbaum Center for Jewish Studies at the University of Toronto. Before moving to the University of Toronto, she also taught at the University of Notre Dame and the University of Vermont. She has several books and any number of publications. Her first book was Twisted Cross on the German Christian faith movement in Nazi Germany. Her second was A Classic War and Genocide, which my students this semester are using as the textbook for their course and which is used in courses on the Holocaust around the world at this point. And her most recent book, and what she will be speaking about this evening, is this new publication, Between God and Hitler, Military Chaplains in Nazi Germany, which is also a brilliant and powerful read. In addition to all of her academic achievements, I will say that during my years working at the Holocaust Museum in Washington, anyone you talk to in the museum, whether they were in the scholarly division or the academic division or the groups that worked with military and police officers and teachers, that she is really a phenomenally brilliant teacher in terms of conveying this information and really engaging students from all over the world and of all ages in what she teaches. So it really is a pleasure to have her here this evening.
Thank you so much, Vicki, for the warm introduction. And thank you also, Jennifer Geddes, and everyone for the invitation. It's such a pleasure to be here. I also want to thank the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum because, as you heard, I'm a fellow there this year. And I want to say at the beginning that the interpretation I'm presenting is my own and does not represent the museum's position. Let me know, by the way, at the back if the volume is okay. So the topic I want to speak about, military chaplains and the Holocaust, is kind of a niche topic. There were about 1,000 Protestant and Catholic clergy who served as military chaplains during World War II. And when I started working on this project about 30 years ago, took long, I did not find much interest. One exception was an early talk I gave in Washington State, where I arrived at the venue and a couple of Vietnam vets were waiting outside. "Are you the person working on military chaplains?" they asked. When I said yes, they told me, "We hated those guys. All they did was patch us up and send us back out again." That was interesting to me. It took some time, but sadly, eventually the world caught up with my interest in military chaplains after the events of 9/11, after the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, more recently in Ukraine and in Israel, Gaza, military chaplains have been in the news a lot. For me, this topic was a way in to think about big questions of the role of religion, specifically Christianity in war, of the importance of institutions, and of the way that systems of power hide themselves. So my talk has 3 parts. You can see them there. And throughout, I want to highlight some of the sources and the process that I've followed in my work. Okay, so part 1, who remembers the Wehrmacht chaplains? My project started out, like a lot of historical projects do, as a gap. I was in the archives researching my PhD dissertation, which you heard about, was a study of the German Christian faith movement. And I came across a letter written by a Lutheran pastor in a small town called Looseland, Saskatchewan, in Western Canada. I'm from Western Canada, and in fact, my father lived in that town of Looseland, Saskatchewan, as a small boy. You can't even find that town on a map anymore. So the letter caught my attention. The pastor, who was a German, was writing to the Protestant Reich bishop, asking to be given a position in the German military chaplaincy. At that point, I had been studying the churches in Nazi Germany for some time. I had never heard anyone mention that there were Christian chaplains in the Wehrmacht, in the German military. So I thought I will look into it. And I started in an obvious place, that is looking at the chaplains' periodic reports. They had to issue reports, same as the military physicians or the military veterinarians, up the chain of command in the Wehrmacht. And these reports were very easy to find in the German Federal Archive, the military archive in Freiburg, many of them also on microfilm at the National Archives in Washington. The problem is, most of these reports, I looked at hundreds of them, were very dry. They were like the one you see here, mentioning the number of religious services held, the number of communions, of burials. They didn't really get into the things that I was interested in. So you can imagine how excited I was when I came across certain individuals who wrote much more fulsome reports. And one of them was a Catholic chaplain called Hermann Reible, who in 1941 and early 1942 was stationed in German-occupied territory in the Western Soviet Union, a region that was, at that point, steeped in violence, mass murder of Jews and Soviet POWs. Reible, in his report, gave a very detailed account of his activities, and even in places became emotional. I was intrigued by this report and by Reible's descriptions of the daily grind of the chaplains, but even more, I wanted to know more about the anguish that he expressed. Was this perhaps a code, a crack in his defenses? From another part of the report, I learned that Reible was quite sick at the time. I think he actually had a heart attack. And I wondered if perhaps his guard had been let down, and that the descriptions of the shredded bodies that we heard were talking not only about wounded Germans, but about the many, many more bodies of Germany's victims that Reible and his men would have seen. But as I spent more time researching, saw the patterns in Reible's own reports and in the other reports, I came to understand that this response on my part was really wishful thinking. Still, Reible's report was important to me as evidence that he was there, like other chaplains, in the midst of the violence. I found more explicit accounts of witnessing acts of atrocity in post-war memoirs of chaplains, but those accounts too always came as if from a vast distance. The chaplains would describe events as they had been told to them, never as they saw them or participated in them themselves, and they always emphasized their own tragic powerlessness. So I was all the more thrilled when I found an account by another Catholic chaplain, Father Ernst Tewes, a report about the events in a German-occupied town in Ukraine called Bielotserkva in August 1941. Tewes' account was not from a report during the war, but rather from a post-war trial. So in the 1960s, one of the German killing squads, one of the Sonderkommando, was brought to trial for the murder of Jews in occupied Soviet territory. And Tewes, along with another chaplain, testified at that event. He described an incident that he had seen with his own eyes in Bielotserkva. This account literally made me almost stop like breathing when I found it in the archives. I wondered if it represented a kind of resistance on the part of chaplains, the evidence of an intact Christian conscience in the midst of the massacre of Jews. As I read more, I learned I wasn't the first to discover the chaplains' responses in Bielotserkva in 1941. In fact, during the time of the trial in the 1960s, the chaplain's testimony was given considerable publicity, and the chaplains were described as heroes who had tried to stop the killing of Jewish children. For me, this was another piece of evidence that showed not only that chaplains were present in sites of mass murder, but that they knew, that they were aware of mass killing of Jews, and that they had moral standing among the men. Elsewhere, Tewes makes it clear that it was German soldiers who approached him and his fellow chaplain, his Protestant counterpart, about the Jewish children in the school. If I had finished my book in the 1990s, but I was supposed to, I probably would have just ended there with my account of the chaplains in Bielotserkva, that they were present, that they knew, and that they tried but failed to intervene. However, I did not finish the book then. And in fact, in 2007, I moved from the University of Notre Dame, where I was teaching, to Toronto, where I took up a position at the University of Toronto, a very different kind of institution than Notre Dame. At Toronto, I was part of the Center for Jewish Studies, a very large and active division. I had many colleagues in Jewish studies, also colleagues across many fields of history, and students as well who spoke many languages other than English and German. All of this stimulated me to approach my topic in different ways. In addition, the fields in which I work were rapidly changing. Between the 1990s and the mid-2000s, Holocaust studies really changed, I think, to become a much more integrated field, a field that placed much more evidence on personal accounts. And history also became, I think, much more attuned to listening for silences in the archives. I was very influenced by the work of Michel Rolf-Trouillot, and also listening for marginalized voices. New approaches of these kinds, new colleagues, got me digging deeper into the context of the murder of the Jewish children at Bielotserkva and the chaplain's role. And I learned a few important things. One of them was that this incident, which occurred in August 1941, actually occurred a month after German troops arrived in Bielotserkva. From July 1941, when the Germans arrived in that part of Ukraine, they were killing huge numbers of Jews every day in public, in open-air shootings. So the incident with the children in the school at Bielotserkva was not a sudden shock, although the chaplains represented it that way in their testimony. It came after weeks of such violence. Second thing I learned from a Jewish source in the region is that, in fact, large numbers of Jewish children had been evacuated from the region and sent to Soviet Central Asia ahead of the German invaders. In other words, there were some efforts to get Jewish children out of the immediate area of combat into safety. Thinking about those evacuation efforts made me consider the number 90 Jewish children. It seemed like such a large number, but compared to the thousands of Jewish children that Germans were killing in that region, I suddenly realized that perhaps 90 was a small rather than large number. In other words, part of a much bigger story. And there was more. I became interested in the name of the city where this massacre occurred, Bilet Cerkva. German sources always mixed up the name. They referred to Bilet Cerkva as an obscure, tiny village. They often got the name wrong. But when I looked at Jewish sources, I discovered that Bilet Cerkva was a major city. It was not a village. It was a city that had been a center of Jewish learning for hundreds of years. It was also infamous as a site of many pogroms, violent attacks on Jews in the 1600s, in the wake of World War I. And the Jewish community in Bilet Cerkva had repeatedly rebuilt itself after those waves of violence. Now, if any of you know any Slavic languages, perhaps you've already recognized that the name Bilet Cerkva or Belayat Cerkov, sometimes referred, means white church, white church. I also discovered, looking at Jewish sources, that some Jews from the region did not refer to the city as Bilet Cerkva, but as Schwarze Tuma, a phrase meaning like black rot or black decay. So a kind of a grim play on words, right? Turning the name white church into black rot. And there's more. My colleague, Anna Sternches, in Jewish studies, who studies Yiddish songs of World War II, found a song about the killing of the Jewish children in Bilet Cerkva in 1941. The song in Yiddish, you see it here, was collected during the war by the folklorist Moshe Beregovsky, who collected Jewish songs from Jews who were evacuated or fled to Soviet Central Asia. This song has been translated from Yiddish to English by Eli Yani, one of our PhD students. Thinking about this song and the various materials led me to ask the question, how had the murder of Jewish children become a tale of noble Christians trying to uphold goodness? And what role did the military chaplains play in that transformation? So this question became central to my project, which brings us to the second part, Saving Christianity, Killing Jews. This phrase is the title of chapter 4, really the core chapter of my book. And it's the chapter that deals with the summer of 1941, the period of the German invasion of the Soviet Union. As I already mentioned, these months, late June, July, August 1941, were a time of an explosion of killing of Jews, of Soviet prisoners of war. Chaplains never mentioned these killings in their reports, but I tried to look into them as part of my book. Now, I started looking in one direction, and as so often happens with historical research, ended up quite somewhere else. And where I started was by looking for photographs of chaplains in the German Federal Archive in Koblenz. I was looking for photos really just to use as illustrations for my book, and I came across a folder labeled Pastoral Care to the Military. The folder included 9 photographs taken in the summer of 1941 by German military photographer of photo service, and they showed the opening of a number of large churches, including a cathedral, the one you see here, in Zhytomyr, the Ukrainian city of Zhytomyr, under German occupation. Now, the photos that I'm going to show you all come from the opening of the cathedral in Zhytomyr. This was a cathedral that had been closed under Stalin. The buildings were used for various purposes. And the Germans, when they came in the summer of 1941, they, with great fanfare, reopened the churches for religious services. The captions that you see there are the original captions, translated by me, speaking of cleaning the churches, taking out the trash, and preparing for the church service with, you can see there, the German soldiers. This image showing the interior of the church after it had been cleansed and redecorated with the swastika flags is the only one of the photos that actually shows a military chaplain. He's very, very, very tiny in the middle there, giving the sermon. It's a Protestant chaplain in this case. And a title with the photos, you don't see it here because it was separate, described the opening of the churches as the Germans giving the gift of Christianity to the Ukrainian people. And as you can see on this photograph, the Ukrainian people in question were, above all, women. The men, prisoners of war, were used to clean the church and then removed with the trash and the filth. Now, as I mentioned originally, I thought these would just be illustrations showing the chaplains in action. And it took me additional years of research, engaging the scholarship, especially of experts on the Holocaust in Ukraine, like John Paul Himka or Wendy Lauer, who called Zhytomyr the epicenter of genocide in 1941, and also the work of a number of research assistants using Russian sources in particular to understand what was actually going on in those photos. Now, one of my PhD students, Ryan Masters, found this photograph in the archives of the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, a photo that was taken in exactly the same time and place as the photos of the church in Zhytomyr. In fact, you could see here on the main square in Zhytomyr in August 1941, Germans were hanging two Ukrainian Jews, Kagan and Keeper, in a public execution. Looking at that photo, it is impossible not to notice how many uniformed Germans were assembled to watch that hanging. This photo, of course, is an amateur photograph, unlike the other professional photos. There are many, many, many photos of this incident, and it was impossible for chaplains in the region not to be aware of this public execution. Chaplains prided themselves on being close to their men and being in touch with their activities. This execution was public in another way too, because the Germans rounded up 400 Jewish men from the region, forced them to watch the execution. They're sitting, you could see, in the exact same square, and afterwards brought them into a nearby forest and shot all of them. Thinking about these sets of photographs together made me realize that the opening of the churches was part of a narrative of righteousness, a narrative that was also supported by biblical texts, including the story of Jesus driving the money changers out of the temple, a story that appears in all four of the Gospels. And it was this story that was preached in the opening of the cathedral in Zhytomyr and many other church openings, where it did not take much adaptation to change the money changers to the Judeo-Bolsheviks being driven from the temple. So the chaplains' presence and their existence even conferred a kind of blessing, implicit or explicit, on the murder of Jews, as did the opening of the churches. Now, in my research, I looked a lot for sermons by military chaplains. That was one of the things that seemed obvious would be useful to have, their sermons. Turns out the sermons are actually pretty difficult to find. The circumstances of military chaplaincy didn't really encourage long sermons, and chaplains didn't necessarily record the messages, take them down that they gave. Luckily, at least one chaplain I studied, Eberhard Müller, a Protestant, he must have been very proud of his sermons because he included excerpts of some of them in his periodic reports, along with his commentary. Now, you can tell from Muller's sermon that he was not a fanatical Nazi. He was preaching from the Christian Bible, standard Christian message. And in fact, I found out from the work of another scholar, Brandon Bloch, that after the war, the same Eberhard Müller was a strong proponent of democracy in West Germany. Nevertheless, the message of his sermon is clear. Who can separate us from the love of Christ? Working with these materials made it clear to me that I needed to get out of the perpetrator gaze in order to understand the military chaplains. I wanted to look at chaplains from other eyes, but this was also not always that easy. So, for example, I had many research assistants help me look through Jewish sources, especially interviews in the USC Shoah Foundation collection. They almost never mention military chaplains, which is not surprising. The chaplains were impossible to spot. They looked like any other officer. However, many Jewish accounts do mention the role of Christianity, and specifically the role of Christian clergy. A very vivid glimpse into the role of clergy in the Holocaust comes from an interview with this woman, Agnes Mandel-Adachi. Adachi is a Hungarian Jewish survivor who was, during the war, baptized as a Protestant. And perhaps it's because of that she was able, in 1945, to move around in the city of Budapest quite freely, working with Raoul Wallenberg, trying to spare Jews from transports. In her interview, Adachi provides a look at one chilling incident she witnessed. Reading this source led me to juxtapose it with the previous source, the sermon from Eberhard Müller. For Müller, the Holocaust, genocide, was presented as part of God's plan, completely compatible with God's boundless love for his people. In Adachi's account, genocide, the Holocaust, looked like a Christian priest killing a Jewish child in front of a church. So that brings us to part 3, genocidal culture. A turning point for me working on this project on military chaplains was when I decided to reorganize the book chronologically. That might sound kind of simple, but I had a more elaborate thematic approach. But when I turned to a chronological organization, I saw some patterns that were quite telling. First of all, seeing how chaplains had responded in the years before 1941 suddenly made it not so shocking how they responded in 1941 to the massacres of Jews that came with the invasion of the Soviet Union. But even more striking to me was the void in my sources that came after 1941. World War II did not end until 1945. What happened in the following 4 years after the shock of that extreme explosion of violence? I came to think about these two sort of types of violence as comparable to an explosion versus a heat wave. Which one is more deadly? In fact, the heat wave can be extremely deadly, right? Because it goes on and on. And those 4 years that followed the explosion of violence in 1941 were equally deadly for those deemed enemies by Nazi Germany. And chaplains were there throughout this period too, the period of occupation. So thinking about those 4 years, I developed this concept of genocidal culture. And what I mean by that is a society that mobilizes its resources, its institutions, so as to enable, sustain, and cover up genocide, cover up often from its own members. To show how this genocidal culture works, I want to turn not to the east, but to the western part of the Nazi Empire, specifically to occupied France. It's sort of complicated, so I hope it won't be too confusing. So this source that you see, I'm not going to have someone read it because I want to explain it to you, comes from a Catholic chaplain's account, but it's describing not his own experience, but an experience someone told him about. And I'll just read it and explain it to you. So he writes, Pakowiak is his name. One evening, General Otto von Stulpnagel, was the German commander in occupied France. General Otto von Stulpnagel invited the senior Catholic chaplain to dine with him. When the two were alone, the general asked the priest, "What do you think of the practice of shooting hostages?" The priest answered evasively, "Sir, you are under orders. What can you do?" But the general would have none of it. "Not like that, Father. I want your opinion as a Catholic priest." And the chaplain answered, "If you ask me that way, then I have to tell you that you cannot justify it." "My opinion exactly," said the general, and handed in his resignation. Stulpnagel was transferred to a distant post and later became involved in the 20th of July, 1944 plot against Hitler. When I found this account, it was interesting to me, but I realized there was no way to verify it. The chaplain is not even named. Stulpnagel killed himself after the war, so you couldn't find out from him. So I filed it under perhaps what might have been the influence chaplains might have wielded. It was an appealing story, though, with the heroic general and the weak, though ultimately righteous chaplain. So I filed that to the side and imagine my shock years later when I found this passage in an essay by the Holocaust scholar Raoul Hilberg and recognized that it was talking about the same event minus the chaplain. Can you understand what's going on there? In the first account, the chaplain presents it as heroism, right? That the general does not want to kill hostages, and the chaplain tells him, "No, you can't," and the general resigns. In this account, we realize, in fact, the general did not want to kill French Christian hostages because he worried that it would be too difficult to control the occupied territories, but he was fully willing to substitute Jews for the French. You understand what's happening there? And there was more. Through the work of the scholar Lauren Faulkner Rossi, I came across a priest called Franz Stock, who's usually described as a prison chaplain, but in fact, he too was a military chaplain, a German military chaplain, whose job included providing last rites, ministering to the French Catholic hostages before they were executed by the Germans. Franz Stock is always presented as a hero of French-German rapprochement, who embodied a human response. In fact, the biography of him is called The Last Human Face. And here's a passage from his diary quoted in that biography. So you understand, Franz Stock, why were those hostages not interested in taking communion? These are the Jewish hostages that were described who had been used to substitute for the French. Franz Stock, by the way, there you can see a stamp with his image, is in the process of being beatified. He will soon be a saint. This is what I mean by genocidal culture. A culture organized to enable, sustain, and cover genocide. Thinking about the period of occupation got me interested in the daily lives of military chaplains. Where did they sleep? Where did they eat? Who did their laundry? One of the things I learned, to my surprise, was that they were often billeted in people's homes in the occupied territories, or they simply seized those homes. And women, Ukrainian women, Russian women, had to keep their households for them. This is never mentioned in the German accounts. One of my research assistants who knew Russian, Sharon Minus, found this account by a Krimchuk woman, a Crimean Jewish woman called Nama Bakshi. They had Germans billeted in their home. They didn't realize they were Jews. They didn't recognize the Krimchuks as Jewish, didn't fit their idea. And reading Sharon's translation of Bakshi's interview, many things were very interesting to me, but the part that stood out, especially in conjunction with chaplains, was the last part of this quote, where Bakshi describes the, quote, SS Gestapo death squad soldiers who, when they initially arrived in the neighborhood, quote, kicked out the residents and took over their homes. To identify that a house was now occupied by Germans, they drew a cross on it. This act of drawing a cross to indicate that a house was now occupied by Germans struck me as surprising. Why a cross? These were Nazis. Why didn't they draw a swastika or SS runes or the letter D or many other possibilities? The cross put them in the long line of Christian tradition, going back to Constantine, to the Crusades, to the plague, to pogroms, where drawing a cross signified protection, blessing, mercy for Christians, and a curse on Jews, the so-called supposed deicides. This action of marking with a cross properties and also people is never mentioned in German accounts of World War II. The only time they talk about crosses is when they boast, chaplains also, that they replaced the SS runic symbols with crosses on graves. However, Jewish sources and Soviet sources often make mention of the cross. So then I began looking for images of the cross, uses of the cross in German warfare. In the process, I found this photograph of Paulette Filer at her first communion in German-occupied France. From the records at the US Holocaust Memorial Museum, I learned that Paulette Filer's mother was a Lithuanian Jewish woman named Rocha Lea Filer, who was arrested and killed at Majdanek. But before she was killed, she managed to get her two daughters, Paulette and her sister, into safety at a convent. When word came to the convent that the girl's mother had been killed, the priest in charge called them into his office and said, "Now you are alone. It is time for you to be baptized." Reading those sources, I wondered, what about the girl's father? Where was he? It didn't take long until I encountered something that almost stopped me in my tracks. Paulette Filer's father was a Russian Jew called Birol Filer, who lived in France before the war. He was involved in the resistance and was rounded up as a hostage, shot in 1942 at Mont-Valérien, exactly in an action like the one Franz Stock described in his diary. In other words, this girl's father was one of the Jewish hostages substituted for French Christians, quote, to keep the peace, in Hilberg's sardonic phrase. The cross was embodied by chaplains themselves who offered protection, sanctification, the promise of salvation to soldiers killed in combat. They also regularly offered not only forgiveness in a general Christian sense, but rites of absolution, including general absolution, which was given by both Protestant and Catholic chaplains. Also, an important part of chaplains' work was providing a Christian burial for soldiers who died, burial that often reassured family members. This letter from the members of an SS man was quoted by a Protestant chaplain in his activity report to show how much his services were valued. And you can see there the parents wrote to him, "Only after we received word, your detailed and comforting letter, did our hearts find some consolation, because we knew that our darling had received a proper burial from you in the memorial cemetery." And I wondered if those parents also perhaps felt comforted knowing that their son had been given a Christian burial, which maybe made them think perhaps he was not a murderer, or if he was, that God had forgiven him. The idea of genocidal culture, I think, also carries over into thinking about saving Christianity as being about killing Judaism as well as Jews. Something that is quite noticeable is how frequently the Germans use Jewish religious sites as places of killing. This synagogue in central Poland, Bełchatów Synagogue, was the site of numerous killing actions, the last of them in August 1942, when the final destruction of Jews in the region took place, and the Jews remaining in that town were rounded up, put into the synagogue, and burned. One of the few who managed to survive that action was this woman, Esther Cinnamon, who now lives in Toronto. That synagogue was located across a very small square from the Catholic Church in Bełchatów. You can see it on this picture. And just a few days after the synagogue was burned, the church was used for a sale of dishes and pots and pans of the Jews who had been killed there. Now, the last point I want to end with has to do with the way that genocidal culture extends to memory. I want to return to a subject that came up in the very first quote, and that's about the execution of German soldiers charged with desertion and other breaches of discipline. During World War II, it's not too widely known, the Germans executed about 25,000 of their own soldiers on such charges. And just by way of comparison, maybe some of you know how many soldiers were executed by the US military on such charges in World War II. The answer is 1. So 25,000 soldiers executed, German soldiers by their own military justice system. Those men had the right to a chaplain's company on the night before their execution, who was there to pray with them. It wasn't always possible because of the sheer numbers and the distances involved. But many chaplains in their reports do talk about being with those men before their execution. Chaplains' reports make it clear that they understood their role to be helping the soldiers see the error of their ways, or as they often described it, their sin against their comrades. However, in a post-war account, probably the most famous German post-war account of chaplains, that particular role got a remake. The man in the center here, Albrecht Goes, is a Protestant theologian and well-known writer who in 1950 published a short book called The Restless Night. The Restless Night. It tells the story of a German Protestant chaplain during World War II who, in the occupied city of Ukraine, Vinnytsia, spends the night with a soldier accused of desertion before the soldier's execution. It's a very wrenching novella that emphasizes the torment of the war and the chaplain's difficult position of trying to maintain a Christian witness in the midst of hell. The book was extremely popular. It was made into a German TV movie in 1955. A British translation, Arrow to the Heart, was also made into a BBC movie in 1955. It's been translated into multiple languages. Another movie was made in 1958. And the author, Albrecht Grüss, won many, many prizes, including the Buber Rosenzweig Prize in the 1970s. Now, Grüss is usually described as a prison chaplain, but he too was a military chaplain. I found him in the records, including in Vinnytsia, exactly where his story was set. The story, Restless Night, includes a grand total of one sentence dealing with Jews and the subject of the Holocaust, and this is the sentence. As for the pogroms against the Jews, various people beyond the circle of those directly involved knew more than they could bear. Now, Grüss, as I mentioned, was himself stationed in Vinnytsia, where the story was set. And if that name, Vinnytsia, sounds familiar to you, could be from the current war in Ukraine, but it could also be from the photograph on the right, one of the most, I guess, well-known photographs of the Holocaust, labeled The Last Jew of Vinnytsia, presumably by the soldier, the German who put it in his album. Although, by the way, new research shows it was not actually in Vinnytsia, but nearby, Berdichev. Juxtaposing that famous photograph of the Holocaust with the still from the movie Restless Night, the 1958 version, I was struck by the contrast. In the photograph, the central drama is between the German shooter about to murder the Jewish man on the edge of the mass grave. You see the other Germans in uniform behind him, the Jews who've already been killed in the grave. In, you could say, the revised version of this scene in the movie Restless Night, the Jews are gone, the killer is gone. Now the human drama is between the two figures of the soldier condemned to death and the chaplain, the soldier embodying the ultimate sacrifice and the chaplain channeling God's boundless love. I want to end with one final image, actually from an earlier period, the time of the German genocide of the Herero and Nama in Southwest Africa in 1905 to 1907. This image was brought to my attention by another former PhD student, Glenn Ryland, who works on missionaries, German missionaries, and their role in the genocide in Southwest Africa. And maybe some of you have seen it. It's part of the mosaic in the Berlin Cathedral of the Beatitudes, here illustrating blessed are the peacemakers. This mosaic, which was put up at exactly the time that the Germans were conducting genocide in Southwest Africa, turns the figure of the Black man into the aggressor and the white figures into both the victim and the victor. Something is binging. Can you hear that? Okay, I don't know what it is, but I have one more sentence. So, this image helped me see what I call a narrative of inversion, literally perpetrators changing the roles to put themselves in the role of victim and put their victims in the role of perpetrators. This narrative of inversion helped me understand the process in the period that I study, the narratives of righteousness. Yet in the Nazi version that the chaplains were part of, there was one crucial refinement that further fortified the narrative because they removed the victims altogether from view. Thank you for your attention.